Hi, I'm Davey Niddle. I'm a graduate student in the English department at Penn, and I'm pleased to introduce the panelists for our final session, The Modernist Bookstore, Frances Steloff and Her Contemporaries. We'll be hearing from Timothy Murray, who is the head of Special Collections Department at the University of Delaware Library. Murray has been a frequent contributor to publishing and lecturing on the issues of acquisition and collection development, access to collections, preservation, ethics, privacy, and the other legal questions relating to literary manuscripts. A specialist in 20th century literary collections, he has curated exhibitions, written, taught, and lectured on such figures as Samuel Beckett, Paul and Jane Bowles, Kay Boyle, William S. Burroughs, Alice Dunbar Nelson, Ernest Hemingway, Ishmael Reed, and Tennessee Williams. His talk today is entitled Never a Dull Moment, Robert A. Wilson and the Phoenix Bookshop. Next, we'll hear from Joshua Kotin, who is an associate professor in the English department at Princeton University. He's the author of Utopias of One, Princeton University Press 2018, and the director of the Shakespeare and Company Project. His talk today is entitled The Shakespeare and Company Digital Project. And finally, from Lynne Farrington, who is senior curator for special collections in the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts here at the University of Pennsylvania. She's currently working on Whitman at 200, Art and Democracy, a major celebration and critical examination of Walt Whitman on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of his birth on May 31st, 2019. A symposium, Whitman at 200, Looking Back, Looking Forward, is scheduled for March 29th and 30th, and an exhibition, Whitman Vignettes, Camden and Philadelphia, opens May 28th in the Kamen Gallery of the Van Pelt Dietrich Library. Her article, A Very Good Book Indeed, Selling Bibles by Subscription in 19th Century America, will be coming out shortly in Printing History 25, and her talk today is entitled The Centaur Bookshop and Press, 1921 to 1942, Philadelphia's own Modernist bookstore. Please welcome our panelists.
As a tribute to yesterday's session that Orchid, Chris, and William did, this is going to be an audio-only presentation. And before getting started, I just want, what? Oh, yeah. Wanted to just talk about my own introduction to the Gotham Book Mart. My first real job in the field of special collections was at the poetry collection of the University of Buffalo. And if any of you have been there, it's one of the most remarkable places on the face of the earth. And I worked there for a little over a year. It was 1979. And I was the de facto acquisition librarian. So essentially, I would see all the new books that came in. And we had two major vendors, booksellers. One was Bertram Rhoda in London, and they were charged with sending us all books of poetry that were published in the UK and Ireland. And our American distributor was the Gotham Book Mart. And so I would get these giant shipments that would come in, and I would get to open them and look through everything. The Gotham would range from these really incredible mimeographs, well, not mimeographs, it's a little late for that, but these great small press publications, incredible little magazines. And then I talked at least twice a week on the phone to Janie Tannenbaum, who, no relation to the Tannenbaum Stephen reference, I don't think, who was the director or the head of their small press division. And I think I learned more that year about the antiquarian book trade, and in particularly the world of small press publishing and little magazines than I did for the rest of my career. During the course of my career, I've worked with numerous book dealers, but there are several dealers specializing in contemporary literature, notably poetry, with whom I've worked closely in every position I've held. One of these was Robert A. Wilson, who operated the legendary Phoenix Bookshop in New York from 1962 to 1988, and who was the subject of my talk today. Robert Alfred Jump Wilson, and if you know the Eastern Shore of Maryland, those are very Eastern Shore names, was born in Baltimore on April 1st, 1922, and enjoyed telling people that he had been voted most beautiful baby at the Maryland State Fair in 1923. He graduated from Johns Hopkins University in 3 years receiving his degree in English and American literature in 1943. After serving in the Army during World War II, where among other things he fought in the Battle of the Bulge and was awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. Following his discharge, he determined to enroll in the PhD program in English at his alma mater, Johns Hopkins. But to his astonishment, the application was rejected because a Hopkins faculty member told him that they did not feel he had a future in the field of literature. Years later, he enjoyed recounting this anecdote, but at the time he must have been bitterly disappointed. Wilson subsequently joined the diplomatic corps and worked briefly as a translator at the Nuremberg war crime trials before being posted to the American embassies in Warsaw, Poland, and later Pretoria, South Africa. In the mid-1950s, Wilson found himself living in New York, where he worked, believe it or not, as the office manager of a cuckoo clock factory. While he was thus employed in a job he didn't particularly like, he was a frequent visitor to the many bookstores that flourished in Manhattan during that period, and developed friendships with many of the figures associated with these shops, including Francis Steloff of the Gotham Book Mart, and most importantly, Larry Walrick, the owner of the Phoenix Bookshop. The Phoenix Bookshop traced its origins back to the 1930s, and possibly even earlier. The early history of the Phoenix is a bit sketchy, and since I'm focusing on the Robert Wilson era of the shop, I did not spend much time trying to research the earlier iterations. I did find a number of libraries that held some of the early catalogs, but it was difficult to date them. I even discovered that we have one of the early catalogs at Delaware, Phoenix Bookshop Catalog number 4, but it bears no date or postmark and reveals little information about the business other than the fact that it was located on East 67th Street, specialized in British and American literature, and provided details on how to place an order. But the unidentified compiler does make reference to the recent death of the British author Ronald Furbank, which occurred on May 21st, 1926. So I suspect the first Phoenix Bookshop opened sometime during the mid-1920s. Robert Wilson became the 5th proprietor of the Phoenix Bookshop when he acquired it in 1962 from Larry Walrick for the price of $12,000. The price included all of Walrick's stock, the business itself, and the lease for the store on Cornelia Street in New York's West Village. In his memoir, Seeing Shelley Plain, Wilson provides a humorous account of the complicated transaction, which took nearly 3 years to complete. But he officially opened for business on April 1st, 1962, and interestingly enough, his first customer that day was Francis Steloff, the owner of the Gotham Book Mart. Wilson's first priority, beyond learning the ins and outs of the book trade, was to clear out the stock left from the previous owner and start to concentrate on his own desired specialties, which were contemporary poetry and modern first editions. The early 1960s was actually a good time to open a literary bookstore. The Phoenix mailing list, which Wilson inherited, contained over 1,500 listings, many of them American academic libraries. During this period, funding for libraries was fairly good, and many libraries were starting to place an increasing emphasis on building special collections of printed books, manuscripts, and archival material. Contemporary literature was especially appealing, and one of the reasons was that it was far more cost-effective than collecting traditional rare books and manuscripts. With his specialization in current poetry, small press books, and little magazines, Robert Wilson found himself in demand. As he began to issue catalogs, institutions made up much of his clientele, and he recalls several libraries that tried to order nearly every title in a catalog. This led to his being asked by a number of libraries simply to send copies of every new book of poetry and occasionally fiction that he could provide. At one point, he had over 20 standing order customers from academic libraries. The 1960s and 70s were also prolific periods for small press and little magazine publishers. Books of poetry and little magazines could be produced cheaply on mimeograph machines and other inexpensive means of printing. When he first took over the Phoenix, one of Robert Wilson's concerns was that he'd be unable to find sources from whom he could acquire new stock for the shop. But that proved not to be a problem. Individuals who had sold books to his predecessor began showing up with offerings, and word got out that the Phoenix was a place where poets, little magazine editors, and small publishers not only welcome, but could often sell multiple copies of their books and magazines. With his strong base of library standing order customers, Wilson would order sometimes 10 or 12 copies of new publications because he knew he could sell them immediately. After taking over the Phoenix Bookshop, Robert Wilson quickly learned that he would need to issue catalogs regularly if he was going to be successful. And one of the things I've pondered over the years was the numbering system of the Phoenix catalogs. In his memoir, Seeing Shelley Plain, Wilson provides an answer. Apparently his predecessor, Larry Walrick, decided to label his very first catalog number 50 because he didn't want to appear to be a novice bookseller. He went on to issue 9 more catalogs. Thus, Robert Wilson's initial catalog was number 60. He had remarkable responses to his catalogs and was particularly successful, as I said, with his institutional customers. Under Robert Wilson, the Phoenix would go on to issue 157 catalogs before the shop closed in 1988. Looking at the Phoenix catalogs today is fascinating. Wilson's first catalogs were printed on the mimeograph machine he had acquired along with the business. So they have a 60s look and feel and are very much a product of that period. With number 97, the Phoenix catalogs began to feature cover illustrations. This particular catalog featured a portrait of Peter Orlovsky on the cover, the original of which was for sale in the catalog for $100. The next 2 catalogs featured original cover artwork by the artist Robert De Niro Sr. and Wilson's good friend Nell Blaine. Subsequent catalogs featured engravings drawn from 18th and 19th century books, giving the catalogs a surrealistic look to them. I wish I had brought some images that I could have shown you of the Phoenix catalogs. The Phoenix catalogs provide a slice of the history of the antiquarian book trade for the world of modernist authors. They also help document the development of the mimeograph revolution and the small press publishing movement that began in the 1960s. Catalogs issued by the Phoenix and its contemporaries function as a bibliographic record of the poets, little magazines, and presses that emerged during that period. The Phoenix issues special catalogs devoted to individual authors, such as Henry Miller and Gertrude Stein, and these continue to serve as valuable reference sources. Finally, as with all booksellers' catalogs from the past, it is fun to look at what books sold for, and at times depressing when you think of lost opportunities. Like the Gotham Book Mart, the Phoenix Bookshop became a gathering place for local poets and artists and a destination for visiting authors and bibliophiles. Robert Wilson delighted in the fact that he was getting to know many of the literary figures he revered and was also befriending the new generation of poets and artists that emerged in the 50s and 60s, many of whom lived in the same neighborhood as his shop. One of Wilson's ambitions for the Phoenix was to develop a publishing program, and as he continued to meet new authors and become familiar with their work, he determined to make this happen. His first publications were born out of necessity. As Wilson tried to track down new and older publications by these authors, he noticed there were no bibliographic guides to their published work. Thus, he started the Phoenix Bookshop Bibliography series. Beginning in 1965, the Phoenix issued bibliographies of the work of Michael McClure, Gregory Corso, Charles Olson, Jack Kerouac, Denise Levertov, Ed Dorn, and Gertrude Stein. Wilson compiled 3 of these bibliographies himself, including the important Stein bibliography. With the exception of Stein, there's a definite slant toward the beat poets and the authors associated with Black Mountain. This was no accident because the Phoenix Bookshop specialized in the work of these 2 groups, and Wilson was a devotee and a collector of most of them. The checklists were quite successful. They sold well, The Kerouac one even had a second revised edition, and they did much to promote the work of these authors. Robert Wilson's greatest ambition as a publisher was to print the poetry of authors he admired. The first such book he produced was John Wiener's second collection of poetry, his breakthrough book, Ace of Pentacles, which came out in 1964. Over the next 15 years, the Phoenix Bookshop issued 27 poetry publications by an eclectic mix of authors, including Wilson favorites such as Marianne Moore, W.H. Auden, Diane de Prima, Michael McClure, and Allen Ginsberg. The most successful Phoenix publishing effort was its chapbook series, which came to be known as the Oblong Octavos because of their distinctive 5.5 by 7.5 inch format. 18 of these chapbooks came out between 1967 and 1979, beginning with Marianne Moore's Tipu's Tiger and concluding with Amiri Baraka's Amtrak. In 1975, Wilson introduced the first Phoenix Christmas keepsake. The keepsakes were all written by Robert Wilson and usually contained his anecdotal accounts of his friendships or visits with various literary figures, including Auden, Marianne Moore, Alice B. Toklas, and Olga Rudge. In one of his Christmas keepsakes, he recounts how he accidentally acquired the original manuscript of William Faulkner's first book, Soldier's Pay. In all, the Phoenix Bookshop issued a total of 47 publications, and I suspect there are probably a few more that I've missed. In addition to the publications Robert Wilson wrote for the Phoenix Bookshop, he was also the author of several successful books. His Gertrude Stein bibliography was published in an expanded edition in 1994 and remains the standard bibliography for this important modernist author. 1980 saw the publication of Modern Book Collecting, in which Wilson presents a guide to collecting first editions for beginning book collectors. The book went through 3 separate editions, the last coming out in 2010. In 2001, Oak Knoll Press published Robert Wilson's memoir, Seeing Shelley Plain, Memories of New York's Legendary Phoenix Bookshop. In Seeing Shelley Plain, Robert Wilson provides a detailed and very readable account of his years as owner of the Phoenix Bookshop. He describes some of his great triumphs, such as acquiring the original working manuscript of Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood, the previously mentioned manuscript of William Faulkner's Soldier's Pay, and the complicated purchase of W.H. Auden's personal library prior to his moving from New York to England. Wilson also details the dealings with many of his the most notable literary figures of the latter half of the 20th century, a number of whom became his close friends. Robert Wilson was also an accomplished photographer, and Seeing Shelley Plain is generously illustrated with his photographs. Finally, what I find most interesting is his day-to-day account of the trials and tribulations, as well as the enjoyment of running a bookshop in the heart of Greenwich Village during one of the most colorful eras in its history. The Phoenix continued to issue catalogs right up until the very end of the business. Like many, I was taken aback when I received Phoenix catalog number 214 and read the introductory text, quote, "This is perhaps the saddest thing I've ever had to write, to announce the permanent closing of the Phoenix Bookshop at the end of this year. This is not something done on a whim, but it's something that has been forced upon me by various uncontrollable circumstances." With rents rising exponentially in New York during the 1980s, the owner of the building in which the Phoenix was housed informed Robert Wilson that he could expect a massive increase in his rent. Wilson realized that he could not afford to keep the Phoenix open, but was hoping to sell the business to somebody who would maintain the shop, continue to run the shop. He attracted a buyer, but when the building's owner backed out of the agreement, Wilson knew the end was near. He sold his New York apartment, closed the shop, sold the stock, placed the archives of the Phoenix Bookshop with the Lilly Library of Indiana University, which one of his which was one of his oldest and best customers, and moved in October 1988, moved permanently to his home in St. Michael's, Maryland, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. Now, the final topic I'd like to discuss is Robert Wilson as a book collector. I think the topic of booksellers as collecting would be worthy of a session by itself. I remember there's sort of two polar opposites. We've mentioned Peter Howard of Serendipity Books, and he really encouraged his employees and himself to build collections, but he made it clear that they were building them for the Serendipity Bookshop, not for themselves. And then you hear stories of booksellers that took too many books home and their businesses suffered. And I think Robert was somewhere in the middle. He had a good balance. He had been a collector long before he became a bookseller, and he concentrated on collecting the work of individual authors. When he took over the Phoenix, he continued to collect and even expand the list of authors in his personal library. Wilson discovered authors early in their career and was often able to acquire their books before the authors became better known and the focus of highly competitive collecting. I got to know Robert Wilson quite well after he closed the Phoenix Bookshop. One day, I can't remember the date, but it was in 1988, and I had been at Delaware just about a year. I received a manila envelope postmarked St. Michael's, Maryland. It was a short list of books typed on 8.5 by 11-inch paper with the heading, Phoenix Bookshop South, catalog number 215. I went through the catalog, identified some items of interest, and ordered them from the library. I subsequently received a few more lists, including one that contained some remarkable items, including a James Joyce manuscript poem and a copy of one of the great Joyce rarities, the broadside poem, The Holy Office, each commanding a very high price. It was obvious that Robert Wilson had not sold the entire stock of the Phoenix. It was not long afterwards that Robert Wilson contacted me and asked if Delaware would be interested in acquiring his collection of the work of the author James Purdy, which we were. This was followed by an offer of his Edward Albee collection, which was quite extensive and included correspondence, original manuscripts, theatrical ephemera, as well as books. This brought about my first visit to his home in St. Michael's. When you visited Robert Wilson in St. Michael's at the home he shared with his longtime friend and partner, Ken Dubrova, you eventually made your way to the library. In addition, Robert had constructed to house his book collection. He had books arranged alphabetically by author, beginning with Albee, then Auden, and ending with Zhukovsky. In a corner was a separate section entirely devoted to Gertrude Stein. There were several dozen authors whose work he collected comprehensively. And as he showed us his Albee collection, Robert said that after a good deal of thought, he had decided it was time to start doing something with his personal collection. His preference was to place them in research libraries where they would be kept intact and made available to students and scholars. Over the next 20-plus years, we were able to acquire a substantial number of his collections, including two of what he termed his big three, Pound, Auden, and Stein, for our collections at Delaware. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Robert was very generously donated a substantial amount of material as well to a variety of institutions. The one collection we finally decided we could not pursue was his Gertrude Stein collection. And my last conversation with him was a teleconference between him and his nephew, who was an executor. And I felt really bad because I had to tell him that we had right of first refusal, and I had to tell him that we just couldn't pursue it. But I'm happy to report that his alma mater, Johns Hopkins, stepped in and acquired the Stein collection for its special collections not long before Robert Wilson passed away in 2016. Hopkins is also the home of his prized collection of the work of fellow Baltimore native H.L. Mencken. In closing, I thought I would read the first couple lines, first and last couple lines of a prose poem written by the poet Ed Sanders, who was a frequent visitor to the Phoenix Bookshop and who operated his own Lower East Side bookshop, the Peaceside Bookshop, during the 1960s. The poem, which was recently published as a broadside, is titled The Bookshops of New York. All hail the beautiful bookshops of New York, the Gotham, the Phoenix, Brentano's, Weiser's, Orientalia, 8th Street Bookshop, Biblio and Tannen, Pageant, the Strand, and of course my own Peaceside. The names are gone, the buildings are torn down, but I remember the bookstores of New York filling our milk crate bookstores with Howl Time tomes. Thank you.
So today I'll be discussing a different bookshop, not Gotham Book Mart. I'll be discussing Shakespeare and Company, but I won't be discussing it as a bookshop at all, but as a lending library. As everyone here likely knows, in 1919, an American woman named Sylvia Beach opened a bookshop and lending library named Shakespeare and Company on the left bank in Paris. Shakespeare and Company quickly became a meeting place for the so-called lost generation and a vital site of contact between French, English, and American writers. In 1922, Beach published James Joyce's Ulysses under the Shakespeare and Company imprint and kind of consolidated the bookshop's reputation as one of the great institutions of modernism. In the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss Shakespeare and Company as a bookshop, as a publisher, but right now I'm going to focus on it as a lending library for reasons that will soon become clear. The first part of the talk talks about Sylvia Beach's archive at Princeton University, where I work. And the second part is kind of a preview of a project that I'm developing to make that material public and analyzable in some interesting ways. So I'll show you the first slide, which is just, so the second slide, I'm moving around. So this is the first flyer for the lending library. And you can see the lending library, this is its first location in 1919, and a year later it moves to its more famous location on Rue de l'Odéon, across the street from Adrien Monier's bookstore. And Monier's bookstore was the model of Shakespeare and Company, and Monier was kind of a model for Beach of a bookseller, and they were life partners for over 20 years. And this is the subscription terms for the lending library when it opened. So when I first got to Princeton, I teach classes on modernism, and I wanted to get to know the collections and rare books, and I was immediately shown to the Sylvia Beach papers, which is such a fairly large collection. You can see it's almost 80 linear feet in 180 boxes. And I started to explore the collection both on my own time and also with my students. And I'd always take them, after getting to know the collection a little bit, I was always drawn to one part of the collection in particular, which were the lending library cards that Beach kept to keep track of the books that circulated in the lending library. So when someone would come into the bookshop and join the library, she'd create an index card for them with their name, their address, and start listing the books that they borrowed from the shop. And I was kind of obsessed with these cards, and I wasn't really sure why, but I'd always bring students to see them, and they were kind of just a fascinating material object. And one year I was teaching in graduate class in Ezra Pound, and I brought the students to the library to look at the Beach collection, Beach's books, Beach's correspondence, her little magazines, and of course the cards. And a student in the class named Jesse McCarthy, who grew up in Paris, looked at the cards and said this would make a great digital project so we could see where all these writers lived during the existence of the bookshop. And that kind of planted a seed that there was something to do with these cards. So this is what the cards look like. This is not eight randomly chosen cards, because they're some of the more famous people that were members. There are about 560 people have extant cards. And I'll zoom in on them in a second. 560 people have extant cards, and there are thousands of cards, so some members have multiple cards. The very fact that the cards exist is kind of thrilling. The other English language library in Paris at the time was the American Library in Paris on the right bank, and that opened in 1920, and they were an ALA affiliated library, so they destroyed all their patron records, both who was a member and what books they borrowed. But Beach, because she did things her own way and wasn't affiliated with the ALA, saved these records. So in some ways, they're kind of complicated and daunting kind of privacy concerns, but we're happy that she didn't destroy the cards. So you see here, Walter Benjamin, and we'll look at that card more closely later, as a card, Janet Flanner, Ernest Hemingway's card, Jacques Lacan as a card, Stein down there, Mrs. Richard Wright. The bookshop was opened in 1919, like I said. It closed in 1941 during the Nazi occupation of France, but Beach continued to loan out books from her apartment above the bookshop until she died. So Richard Wright was a close friend of hers in the late 40s, and that's when that card is from. So here's some more cards. These are the Stein's cards, the Leo Stein and Gertrude Stein. And this is Hemingway's cards. It's like a bit of a closer look at the cards. So with my students, and especially Jesse, started thinking about what we could learn from these cards if we figured out a way to kind of analyze them and digitize them. And we kind of came up with 3 sets of questions. So I'm going to share those sets of questions with you, and then you can see how we went about answering them in the digital project, or have begun to answer them in the digital project. So the first set of questions concerns how the library was used. So what did our favorite authors read? What did they read in common? So you can think about what Hemingway and Stein read in common, or more interestingly, perhaps what Stein and Joyce read in common. How did they read? How long did they borrow books for? I can show you one of my favorite cards. We'll come back to all these cards. But M.A. Césaire's cards. Sorry. Good. So this is the one from 36. So you see in 36, he's borrowing Langston Hughes's Weary Blues for 2 weeks, or for a month. And then a year and a half later, he comes back to the bookshop and resubscribes and borrows it again for 3 weeks, along with Kane and Spring in New Hampshire. Anyway, go back to Hemingway. So what books did they borrow together, and how long did they borrow books for? What can borrowing patterns reveal about a book's influence? What is the connection between so-called high and low culture in the period? Scholars often understand the period as one of polarization. High art becomes separate from so-called low art. Texts like Ulysses in the Wasteland are understood as creating, or at least reflecting, a new elite. But perhaps the division was not as significant as we thought, or perhaps the separation did not reflect individual reading practices. Were people reading detective novels along with high modernist texts, or better, high modernist texts with the detective novels? We were also just interested in discovering what we thought of as kind of lost classics. Right? So we have these books that we affiliate with modernism, and we have so many more that we hadn't heard of before, and starting to investigate what their significance was. Books that have been long out of print and sometimes long forgotten, at least by us. So our second set of questions concerned who used the library. So how did the lending library community change between 1919 and 1941? What is the overlap between the lending library community and the expatriate community in Paris more generally? What was the impact of the Great Depression, or the murder of Sacco and Vanzetti? The rise of fascism in Europe. What percentage of the lending library's members were women, or French, or any particular nationality? Was the lost generation really a generation? Well, the card provided all these names, and started to think about what kind of community those names represented. And then we started thinking about the addresses on the cards. Where did members of the lending library live? Did where they live change over the course of the bookshop's existence, or lending library's existence? Did they live close to each other, or spread across Paris? My collaborators and I started imagining creating new maps of Paris, new itineraries around the city. One could trace the circulation of a favorite writer as they moved around the city, or the circulation of a favorite book. We started imagining maps, Sylvia Beach's Paris, Hemingway's Paris, Joyce's Paris, or the thing that we were most excited about, Ulysses' Paris. We imagined that we could create maybe a new kind of Bloomsday every February 2nd, which is Joyce's birthday and the day that Ulysses was first published, where you could walk around the city following how people borrowed the book. Our third set of questions were more theoretical or philosophical. One of the big questions that orients my research more generally is the nature of artistic communities. So one can ask, with respect to the cards, what was an artistic community? What was an artistic community in interwar Paris? We know about self-identified communities, surrealists, futurists, etc. We know about communities as they're defined by a discrete literary project, the editors of a magazine. We can now identify communities, or better, networks, based on where writers published. But few of these approaches tend to think about geography in relationship to community. And we were thinking about that over the course of this whole conference, thinking about what did it matter that there was one site that people actually got together in person. So few people think about the importance of geography, and especially proximity to social networks. The question of proximity were central to discussions of community from the very beginning of sociology. Ferdinand Tonys, for example, thought that proximity was one of the most important elements differentiating community from society. And this is a Tonys quote. All intimate, private, and exclusive living together, so we discover, is understood as life in a community. Society is public life. It is the world itself. In community, one's with one's family. One lives from birth on, bound to it, in weal and woe. One goes into society as one goes into a strange country. Modernity is usually understood as to mark the destruction of community, or at least minimizing the importance of proximity to community. Think about social networks today and the lack of importance of proximity to community. Addresses are the strange kind of public, private instrument for thinking about how proximity influences the formation and dissolution of literary communities, and how proximity influences taste. So we had these questions in our mind as we kind of were going forward with this project. So we decided to make a digital project out of the cards, and this project started about 4 years ago, and we've been kind of doing it with my left hand since then. So we can look a little bit more closely at some of the cards, and I can go back to them in the Q&A if people are interested. This is Stein's first card from 1920. This is when she first came to the bookshop. You can see P.T. Barnum is the first book she borrows. This is Simone de Beauvoir's card from 1937. She's reading a lot of Faulkner, Passos, Woolf. This is Jacques Lacan's card from 1941. He borrows one book, which is The Concise History of Ireland. And when I first saw that card, I'm like, why would he be borrowing The Concise History of Ireland? But then it's because, as we figured out, actually someone's written an essay about this. He was reading Ulysses at the time, and Stuart Gilbert refers to this book in his guide to Ulysses. So Lacan was presumably reading it because he owned a copy of Ulysses, or perhaps he was reading it in French. Monnier published a translation of Ulysses, and he wanted the history of Ireland to help him make sense of the book. This is the most poignant card, or one of the most poignant cards in the collection, because Benjamin commits suicide later that year. So the two books that he borrows. And I've shown you the Aimé Césaire cards. So we started working on this project, and we soon realized, so our first impression was, these cards were it. This was the lending library community. We had records for everyone. And then questions, we looked more closely, and questions started arising. Like why, Hemingway's cards start in 1925. He supposedly was a member of the library earlier than that. There are strange gaps in people's cards. People that we knew were members don't have cards. It was a fairly small data set. And as I started exploring more in the Beach archives, I found an entirely new set of materials that explained what the cards actually represent. So the cards give this incredibly deep sense of how the lending library operated, but it's not a very broad sense. It's only some of the lending library members. But Beach, because she was incredible, kept logbooks as well for every single day of the bookshop's existence. So every single day that the bookshop was open, she would say, who came in to borrow books, to make us to join the lending library, what books were sold. Eventually started keeping separate copies just for Ulysses to track the circulation of Ulysses and Joyce-related materials. But I picked this page just because it's February 2nd, 1922, so that's the day that Ulysses was published. So it's the most famous day in the history of the bookshop. And it goes back to what Paul Moore was saying yesterday about the relationship between kind of the fantastic and the canonical, mythological almost, and the everyday. So the day she's publishing Ulysses, which was a heroic effort, she's also working in the bookshop, selling maps, 3 men in a boat, and subscriptions to 3 lending library members. So this is a detail from the logbook from that day. Again, we're missing some logbooks from 1930, but for the rest of the time of the bookshop's existence, we have this incredibly broad account of who subscribed and who the members were. So again, the data set is this incredibly horizontal but shallow account of all the names and their membership lengths, and then this partial but incredibly deep account of some names we have complete borrowing records for. Started exploring the archive even more and found a couple other interesting documents. So this is an address book that Beach started making in 1936, where she listed every single member that had ever joined and their address. But again, this is another one of my favorite documents because it's very Beach-like. So it's meticulous, but also totally idiosyncratic. So she starts with A, and she goes, I only have this page and one other page to show you, but this is B. But she gets to N, and then she just stops. If something else occurs to her, and she abandons the project. So we have this kind of complete record with addresses, but it stops at N. And this is the last archival slide that I'll show, I think. This is the notebook she started when she first started building the lending library. So in 1919, in September, the bookshop opened in November. She went around Paris buying all of the English language books she could. And these are the first 66 through 85 and how much she paid for them. Okay, so this is the project we've started to build from these materials. I put this link here in case you have your laptop. There's kind of an interactive demo version of the site that we have ready. You can email me and I can send it to you. It's also very, very basic, so you're not really missing much if you don't take your laptops out now, but you're welcome to. So this is the landing page of the project. And this is kind of what the font didn't transfer for some reason for the file, so it looks a little bit different, but click on the top right of the page, you get this menu of items. And some of them we have, again, the fonts didn't transfer over on this computer, but you can get the sense of being able to scroll through the names, be able to search the names by subscription year, by book borrowed, by different demographics, by name of the lending library member. This is a drop-down file that you can pick the limit by nationality, arrondissement, profession, birth year, sex. This is when you find a particular member and you click on the member's name, you get a map of where they lived in the city, and you get their membership timeline of when they were an active member of the bookshop. And you can click on books borrowed and get a list of all the books that they borrowed over their career as a member. Some of the books they purchased. And you can also explore their lending library cards if you're just interested in getting the actual material artifact that we're making available online. But all the contents of the cards were transcribed by incredibly diligent graduate students and it's all searchable. I think that's, so there'll be similar pages for each of the books. So you can scroll through, search the books, to limit the books, like you would in a library catalog, as if Beach had a computer when she operated Shakespeare Company. Each book will have its own page giving its history of how it's circulated around the Lynne Library members. And these are just some basic analytics that we've done so far. So this is membership counts for the first 8-9 years of the library's existence. So at its peak in 1926, it had 315 active members in the winter. This is January 1926. And you can see, based on the season, in the summertime it dips because people go vacation, and the winter it rises. And it's going to fall off drastically in the late 20s. And then Beach will kind of change her business model and start catering more to French readers who are interested in English language books, and it will start rising again. This is a very basic, and now out of date, but you get a basic sense of the most frequently borrowed books. So these numbers are very low, because we've done a lot more analysis, but you get a sense of a few things. One, periodicals were the most frequently circulated materials in the Lynne Library, for good reason. It was very hard to get subscriptions to your apartment in Paris from North America and from England. It was very expensive, so you go to Shakespeare Company and borrow The New Statesman and Time and Tide. Ulysses is very high up, so you can see poems there because we haven't edited it. So everything that is called poems is being included in that number. Ulysses, because it was very expensive, circulated very frequently because Shakespeare Company was a place to get it. Then some books we hadn't heard of when Sparkenbrook by Charles Morgan, we were totally surprised. What's Sparkenbrook? So each kind of card and each title is its own little research project that we're starting to undertake. And then finally, this is a little map that we made of the right bank. So it's a sense that the assumption is that the right bank would go to the American Library of Paris, and the Bohemian left bank would go to Shakespeare Company. But for a lot of, in hindsight, obvious reasons, a lot of Americans and a lot of French readers of English language books lived on the right bank. So there's just a selection of some of the names, but each dot represents a different member. In blue and the red marks institutions that would be relevant to those members. Thank you very much.
I too want to thank David and Camille, Kate and Brad for all the hard work on this conference. It's been great. And thanks to all the speakers. It's been a wonderful experience hearing all of you. I was going to say that in some way my paper will touch on many of the topics covered by speakers at this conference, from Andrew Thacker's keynote onwards. But I would like to say that I can't cover gory anthologies, but I can say that when I was a senior graduating from Wellesley College, I spent a lot of time reading those anthologies. They helped to get me through that senior year. And that we have Patti Smith coming to the PMA, Philadelphia Museum of Art, on May 30th for the big Whitman bicentennial. So those are the two ways I can talk about them. Whoops, do I need to use this one? Oops, sorry, there we go. The Centaur Bookshop and Press was one of the many long-departed and mostly forgotten Philadelphia institutions that played a significant role in the intellectual and cultural life of the city in the decades between the two world wars. Despite its brief 21-year lifespan from 1921 to 1942, Centaur managed during the short period time to attract a range of writers and artists, intellectuals, and collectors to its avant-garde bookshop, which specialized in modern first editions and art books, as well as the literary and philosophical magazines of the day. Importantly, in addition to its bookstore, Centaur became a publisher of bibliographies and fine press books. The Centaur Bookshop opened its doors at 1224 Chancellor Street on October 1st, 1921, less than 2 years after Sylvia Beach opened Shakespeare and Company in Paris and Francis Steloff opened the Gotham Book Mart in New York City. Centaur was the brainchild of Harold Trump Mason, a 21-year-old Philadelphian of some means who loved cars, dogs, and women. As Mason himself admitted, it was my idea of what a career ought to be. The name for the bookshop came from a line, "Up on my back, said the Centaur, and I will take you thither," in the then popular novelist James Branch Cable's Jurgen, a work prohibited in the United States at the time. According to Mason, the reference lent an air of mild wickedness to the enterprise, though years later he described the novel as about as innocent a book as you could possibly imagine when you think of what they have today. The first home of the Centaur Bookshop when it opened in 1921 was a 3-story, 100-year-old brick house, small and undistinguished. Its 1224 Chancellor Street location just around the corner from Camac Street, then known as the Little Street of Clubs. Camac Street was described during this period by House Beautiful as the greatest little street in the world, its original houses taken over by library and art clubs, inns, and small shops. Mason would later refer to his shop as being in a very small alley just below Walnut Street on 13th. Well, Mason opened Centaur Bookshop. When Mason opened Centaur Bookshop, he was looking around for a career, and according to his wife and daughter, that is, starting a bookshop, was a stylish thing to do in those days. The Centaur Bookshop stock focused on modern literature, including first editions, limited editions, fine printing, and signed copies. Mason, during the years he ran Centaur, would have occasion to stock, import, or smuggle, you choose your verb, and sell prohibited works, including Joyce's Ulysses and Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, under the counter, of course. This was true as well as other modernist bookshops like the Gotham Book Mart, where Francis Steloff carried these and other banned books, including Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer and Black Spring. Steloff was in trouble more than once when John Sumner, as we know, and the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, the same group that brought claims of obscenity against the Little Review when they were publishing installments from Ulysses. In Paris, Sylvia Beach had helped American and English customers disguise their copies of Ulysses as Shakespeare's works, complete in one volume, or merry tales for little folks to smuggle them home. The D.H. Lawrence Centaur letters, which are at the University of Texas at Austin, are evidence that Mason tried to smuggle books into the United States for sale to his customers. In a July 5th, 1928 letter, Lawrence writes to Mason, "We are mailing your copy of Lady Chatterley today. When you get it, would you be so good as to wire received? I am so anxious to know the book arrived safely. I was awfully grateful to you for getting me orders and being so kind about this venture. Let's hope we pull it off." The Centaur, however, had a Janus personality. By day and downstairs, it had proven to be a somewhat successful bookstore, although its income probably did not cover expenses, let alone pay Mason a real salary. After hours, the top floor became a gathering spot for a select group of friends and patrons, including contemporary writers and artists. Downstairs it was business, upstairs pleasure. While it's not clear to what extent Mason saw himself as a bookman, accounts by those who knew him are contradictory. Though I would say he did take books seriously, he certainly saw himself as a host, and the Centaur as about more than just books. It was also a space in which cocktails were mixed. This was during the Prohibition in the United States, after all, and conversation flowed. Something, in fact, between a private club, a speakeasy, and a salon, Centaur provided a rather informal locker room upstairs on the 3rd floor of the Chancellor Street and 2nd floor of the South Juniper Street's location, where members stashed their bootleg hooch. According to the publisher Bennett Cerf, a longtime friend, Harold Mason and his sprightly young wife Anne would disappear to the top floor and begin mixing the murderous concoctions that passed for cocktails in those parts. Mason's friend and financier John Lewis, who was a very amusing guy in those days, used to say that Centaur was known for the fact that it tried to sell what nobody wanted, namely books, and gave away what everyone wanted. Among the regulars, there were the writers Christopher Morley and Joseph Hergensheimer, the artist Clinton Begary, the antiquarian bookseller A.S.W. Rosenbach, and John Frederick Lewis Jr. Others, like the artist Wharton Esherick, dropped by when they were in town. This Club Mason program, which Mason probably printed for a special occasion upstairs at the Centaur, reflects his sense of humor. It includes a request from management, printed on the back of the program, that guests kindly observe the 18th Amendment and the Seventh Commandment, the former establishing prohibition, the latter prohibiting adultery. Mason, like Beach and Steloff, influenced people in publishing as well with their recommendations of books and manuscripts, turning the usual top-down publisher-to-bookseller model on its head. Bennett Cerf, while acting as a sales representative for Random House, recollected frequently coming away from the Centaur with an order that was only $50 smaller than the total of books that Herald had managed to sell to me. Moreover, Cerf, who would go on to become William Faulkner's publisher, first encountered his work on a visit to Centaur, where, at Mason's recommendation, he purchased a copy of Sanctuary. Mason, though, was not content with Centaur being simply a bookshop and watering hole for avant-garde artists and writers. He had larger aspirations for the enterprise, and soon Mason and David Juster Jr., his partner in the bookshop during its first decade, were also publishing. They produced not just catalogs, but also broadside advertisements for works by such modern writers as Woolf, Lawrence, O'Neill, Joyce, Yeats, and Mencken. It's worth noting that the very first catalog includes a copy of Lawrence's privately printed first edition of Women in Love for $12.50, while the fifth catalog, dated Winter 1924, includes a 1922 London second edition of Ulysses for $35. Moreover, Lawrence shows up second on its list of the 10 authors whose first editions were most in demand at the Centaur Bookshop in 1923. And this is printed on the inside back cover of the Winter 1924 catalog. Centaur catalogs also advertised books from such fine and private presses as Nonesuch, Golden Cockerel, and Black Sun, as well as new works that they had commissioned specifically for the Centaur. Centaur's first publications were a series called the Centaur Bibliographies of Modern Authors that began appearing in 1922. The first one was for Philadelphian Joseph Hergesheimer, a prominent and popular early 20th century American author of naturalistic novels about decadent upper-class life, who went from great acclaim in the 1920s to pretty much total obscurity by the 1950s. Java Head, 1919, a story of miscegenation told from various perspectives, it was considered his best novel. This was followed by bibliographies of Stephen Crane, James Branch Cabell, I'm not sure of pronunciation, of course, H.L. Mencken, Carl Van Vechten, D.H. Lawrence, Norman Douglas, Theodore Dreiser, and Ambrose Bierce, with later supplements for Lawrence and Cabell. These bibliographies, printed by the Torch Press in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, were published in trade and larger paper editions, ranging from between 35 and 100 large paper copies and between 300 and 500 trade edition copies. Centaur continued publishing them until 1932. The sixth Centaur bibliography dealt with the works of D.H. Lawrence. Lawrence himself wrote its foreword, which served as a kind of counter-bibliography. Rather than focusing on the publishing history and physical attributes of his works, his bibliography recalled the memories and emotions that each title evoked for him. The Lawrence bibliography worked to establish Lawrence as a member of the modern canon because of or despite the controversial nature of his writings, while simultaneously providing readers, collectors, and even the author himself with an accounting of his varied output over the years. For a few authors for whom Centaur did not produce full bibliographies, such as Ford Madox Ford, the shop printed checklists at the back of its catalogs. Why would Centaur Bookshop open its publication program with a series of bibliographies of contemporary authors? Given a stock focused on contemporary authors whose reputations might not yet have been fully formed, such bibliographies contributed to canon formation, that is, to establishing certain authors and works as having a status deserving of scholarly and collecting attention and literary longevity. The Centaur's choices achieved a certain authority because Mason and Justin made it clear that they had selected some authors and not others for inclusion in their bibliography series. Moreover, bibliographies served an important advertising function as well. Not only did Centaur stock new titles, but it also carried first editions of works by authors whom Mason and Juster considered important and influential, in which they wanted to sell to readers and collectors. How better to make those readers and collectors aware of other works by authors they were reading at the moment than by providing them with up-to-date bibliographies with specific information on each work in the author's corpus. According to Mason, he first encountered the local Philadelphia artist Wharton Esherick when he stopped by the Centaur in 1922. It was during one of these early visits that Wharton showed Mason a copy of the first book he had illustrated with his own woodcuts, Mary Marcy's children's book of verse on evolution, Rhymes of Early Jungle Folk. Wharton asked Mason to carry the book in his shop. Mason was impressed with Rhymes, whose controversial nature clearly appealed to him. The results of this encounter was a conversation about doing a book project together. Embarking on publishing fine press books was not so far-fetched an idea. Rather, it was a way of extending what Mason and his partner David Jester were already doing, given their interest in fine printing and design. While the bibliographies were published under the name of the Bookshop, these more literary and fine press books were published under the Centaur Press imprint. The first project that resonated with Mason, Esherick, and Jester was an edition of Walt Whitman's Song of the Broadaxe, 1924, with original illustrations by Esherick. Mason's sensitivity to fine printing and design had a direct impact on all Centaur publications, even its most ephemeral items such as catalogs, prospectuses, letterheads, and order forms. Many of the Centaur titles were published in limited editions, some signed, and almost all of the bibliographies were published, as I mentioned, in both regular and large paper editions. Wharton Esherick would go on to do illustrations for 3 more Centaur books. As a follow-up to Centaur's success in gaining Lawrence's permission to do the bibliography, Mason asked Lawrence if he would be willing to publish a work with Centaur. As Lawrence wrote to Edward MacDonald, his bibliographer, on September 24, 1924, "I like the Centaur as a symbol, would like to write a Centaur story, but can't in these white countries where the lower half of man is an automobile, not a horse." However, Lawrence did ultimately agree to let Centaur publish some of his essays, including reflections on the death of a porcupine. As Harold Mason later recalled in an interview he did for the Wharton Esherick Museum, the Centaur appealed to him, Esherick, very much, and it also appealed to another very famous friend of ours, and that was D.H. Lawrence. And we did a book of his, Reflections on the Death of a Porcupine, a book of essays. And one of the reasons we got that book from Lawrence was that he loved Centaurs, and he had a warm spot for the funny little Centaur press. In addition, during the early years, Esherick did the 2 woodcuts of the front of the shop, and a beautiful centaur with a wooden body and iron legs to replace the very ordinary, dull kind of sign outside the shop. This wood and iron centaur is now on display at the Wharton Esherick Museum, so if you ever go there, you'll see it there. Esherick, in addition to the centaur sculpture he did for the shop sign, drew pages of centaurs, all different. Esherick would go on to do the woodcut of a porcupine, as we saw on Centaur Press's second book, D.H. Lawrence's Reflections. After that, Wharton illustrated the 3rd and 4th Centaur Press publications, A.E. Coppard's Yokohama Garland and Other Poems, and a stunningly erotic version of the Song of Solomon, published in 1927 in an edition of 525 copies. These were both designed and printed by Elmer Adler's Princeton printers, which were then located in New York City. Yokohama Garland was chosen by the Society of Graphic Arts as one of the 50 best books of that year and exhibited at the New York Public Library and public libraries and museums across the United States. According to Mason, Song of Solomon was the most interesting book Wharton did. The distribution was taken over by the author and publisher Bennett Cerf in his role as a sales representative for Random House. For as Mason had to acknowledge, one hard thing about a small press is the problem of distribution, and we've talked about that. We could take the book and have it printed somewhere. In this case, I believe it was done in Princeton, but the actual selling of the book is a very hard thing for a small firm to do. Cerf, however, sold 500 copies in no time at all. The financial issues surrounding these publications kept Centaur Press from publishing anything else until 1930, and the works that followed were far less elaborate affairs. Moreover, none of them were illustrated by Esherick, and none more were printed by Princeton printers. In 1930, Centaur published James House Jr.'s 50 drawings, which were printed at the Oshiva Studio Press in Philadelphia in a limited edition of 150, presumably because the market for such books was limited during the Depression. In 1932, Centaur published both Paul Valéry's The Graveyard by the Sea, which is seen here, printed in an edition of 300 hand-set copies by Burnley Weaver at the Galafox Press in Biltmore, North Carolina. And they also published an anthology of younger poets with a preface by Archibald MacLeish, printed by the Haddon Craftsman, who printed many of the later Centaur books. 1933 saw the publication of Andre Speer and his poetry and George Francis Witzel's Jealous Mountain, while in 1934 Centaur brought out a trade and special edition of Sherwood Anderson's No Swank, as well as a broadside with 2 woodcuts by Wharton Esherick, and this is the last thing he did for them. 1935 saw the publication of only one book, John Knight Shyrock's Desire in the Universe, A Study of Religions, while 1936 was more prolific with the publication of 4 titles. Not surprisingly, though, for a dog lover like Mason, the 4th title that year was Tony Sees the World, a collection of photographs of and accompanying poems about Tony, an adorable wire-haired terrier, and his travels and exploits. The last book published under the Centaur imprint was Catherine Garrison Chapin's Lament for the Stolen, a poem for a chorus, which came out in 1938. One of the very last Centaur publications, the Priapeia, 1937, a collection of erotic poetry, had no specific imprint, claiming it was privately printed, a claim most likely made to avoid getting Mason and his colleagues into trouble with the authorities. The colophon states 150 copies printed and nothing more, though the late bookseller David Holmes noted that his copy, now at Penn, was acquired from Philadelphia bookseller George Allen, who claimed it was a publication of the Centaur Press. Allen told Holmes that he had bought a large number of copies, presumably remainders, from Harold Mason. This claim about the origins of the book is confirmed in one of the scrapbooks Mason assembled of printed and manuscript materials relating to Centaur, in which the prospectus announcing a limited subscription edition of the Priapeia is found taped on the page marked 1937-1938. In addition to working with and for Centaur himself, Wharton Esherick also introduced his friends, the writers Sherwood Anderson and Theodore Dreiser, to Harold Mason. And by the late 1920s, both Anderson and Dreiser were hot commodities, and Mason went on to publish works by and about both of them, as I mentioned, the bibliography of Dreiser's works appearing from Centaur in 1928. Not satisfied with simply publishing bibliographies and fine press books, Mason and some of his friends, including the architect George Howe, who designed the PSFS building with his partner William Lacaze, and that's an important building in Philadelphia, decided to start a new magazine, USA. Its contents page boldly declared USA to be a quarterly magazine of the American scene, and stated that USA is frankly a magazine of opinion. Its contents are often controversial and, as we hope, stimulating. The first issue came out in the spring of 1930, not long after Black Tuesday, the stock market crash of October 29, 1929. Begot during the Roaring '20s, it also proved to be a victim of the Great Depression, surviving for less than a full year. Only 3 issues, spring, summer, and fall, were published before its demise. Bennett Cerf later remarked that USA was a magazine that wasn't very good, but that gave the editors many months of happy confusion. In those many months, however, its editors, and the masthead changed with every issue, managed to convince a number of important American literary and artistic figures, among them William Carlos Williams, Walker Evans, Edward Weston, and Thomas Hart Benton, to publish their work on its pages. In 1931, when the American Booksellers Association convention was held in Philadelphia, Mason wrote a piece for a humorous takeoff on Publishers Weekly, a publication in which he may well have played a larger role. Howie Tooey Runny, a smally bookie shoppy, by Eunice Twittery of Ye Twittery Bookie Shoppy, Inc., makes fun of the naive bookshop owner who, among other things, advises making holiday recommendations to customers, such as Lady Chatterley's Lover for Mother's Day. The shop itself moved to 206 South Juniper Street in early 1933, a move occasioned in part by the lack of amenities at the Chancellor Street location, where the only heat came from fireplaces. According to Mason, Esherick and others were members of the safari that moved the contents of the Centaur bookshop from our first miserable little place in the Chancellor Street alley just below Walnut to the Library Company building on Juniper Street, and a very lovely place it was. It had a lovely little garden in the back, and we had two little workman houses in the back of that, with the windows opening right on the garden where the miserable parking lot is now. But the move over was fun because we all pitched in, and I can remember Wharton very well doing a yeoman's job of moving books and pictures and everything else in the world. The new shop was larger and easier to navigate, as seen here. In keeping with the times, Centaur added a phonograph record department where customers could listen to the latest recordings prior to purchase. According to Mason, we were the first, I think, to become a book and record shop, which seems a contradiction because you want quiet when you read a book, and here we were selling something to distract from the quiet. But it was a successful combination, actually. Centaur even gave away record cleaners to advertise their new record shop. In 1937, the Centaur Record Shop proposed initiating a lending library of records, membership in which will be $5 a year, plus 25 cents for each album borrowed. The size of the library stock will, of course, be dependent upon the number of subscriptions received. There is no indication, however, of whether this subscription record library ever actually existed, let alone whether it was a success or a failure. Centaur's reach extended far beyond Philadelphia, both in terms of the patrons who frequented the bookshop and the writers and artists who socialized there. Some New York City bookstores with similar stock and clientele, such as the Holiday Bookshop and the Gotham Book Mart, sold Centaur publications. All three shops opened within a year of each other, part of the post-World War I cultural explosion that would alter the nature of American literature and letters in ways still under study. Its catalogs of modern first editions, desirable and scarce items, English and American authors, as well as Centaur bibliographies issued by the bookshop, were advertised in the New York Times. The bibliographies were also announced in the Book and Authors and Notes on Rare Books columns of the Times, and a number of Centaur publications received full reviews. Even Esherick's woodcuts for the Centaur edition of Whitman's Song of the Broad Axe found their way into the Times twice, once in late 1924 and again in 1925. Bennett Cerf, in Death of a Centaur, his 1942 obituary for the Centaur Bookshop and Press, refers to people in the literary world all over the country saddened by its demise, indicating its widespread influence. According to Cerf, back in the glorious 20s, the Centaur Bookshop shared with Sessler's, and Sessler's was bought out in 1979 by Graham Rader and then closed, shared with Sessler's a virtual monopoly on the then flourishing trade in expensive press books and modern first editions in Pennsylvania. Indeed, its bulletins and catalogs reached collectors all over the world. Centaur closed its doors in 1942, shortly after the United States entered World War II. Mason himself had already departed by 1938 at the request of his benefactor, John Lewis, to become manager of the Academy of Music, where he would continue until his retirement. And the shop went on to be run by the able Star Cornelius, who had formerly worked at Charles Sessler's bookstore. The ostensible reason for closing Centaur was that the Library Company of Philadelphia was taking over the building at South Jupiter for use as a branch library. That never happened, and years later the building was torn down and the land sold for development as a parking garage, which stands there today. In truth, it appears that the Centaur had run its course. Times were changing, and in a refrain that has been heard ever more frequently in the years since 1942, it had become more and more difficult for a small independent bookstore to survive. No longer would people meet at the sign of the Centaur. Thank you.
I know that in order to make ends meet, some bookstores would sell art, and I know that Sessler sold Japanese woodblock prints, and often you'll come across a Japanese woodblock print that'll have the Sessler's label on it, and that's very desirable because I don't think he really sold restrikes. And I was just wondering how often that would happen. It seems that other bookstores had an affinity for Japanese woodblocks also, and I was just wondering if anybody knows anything about that. Or maybe art in general, like trying to.
I think a number of bookstores have over the years sold art as well, or sold prints primarily, whether they're Japanese or other prints. And in fact, the early image of the only image I can find of the first location at the Chancellor Street location for the Centaur, there's a bunch of Wharton Esherick's woodcuts in there. So I think he was trying to sell some of them there during that period. So I think early on they did have some art. I think less so later on at the Centaur. But they ended up selling chocolates as well. I mean, I cut that out because, but there were other things that they were trying to sell. So in addition to records, they go on to do that as well.
Corey is the example, of course, of
Corey,
use of art.
Each sold collectibles constantly. So she opened the shop. She had Blake drawings that at hard times she sold, and she had some Whitman manuscripts that she sold quite early. And then once, very quickly, by the late 20s, the bookshop itself was becoming incredibly famous, and she would sell Joyce paraphernalia, either pages of proofs or signatures. And then the releases themselves, two of the three first edition issues of the first edition were collectible copies. But the Blake and the Whitman were especially kind of poignant things for her to sell, which she couldn't make ends meet. She inherited from her.
I was just going to say Ed Sanders had a rather eclectic exhibit sometimes, selling people's pubic hair.
Yeah.
He tried to convince me to please contribute. Too shy.
He used to issue these great catalogs.
Yes, his catalogs are wonderful, with his wonderful his Egyptian hieroglyph.
I always wondered whether those were actually those special editions of the Ed Sanders Funky Press material, whether the pubic hair editions were actually a joke or for real.
No.
Oh, yeah.
They were on exhibit.
Another thing that I've seen is when they produce limited editions, often they would print out extra copies of the prints and then sell them separately.
I know the Sunwise Turn bookshop that I've looked at is very much concerned with presenting itself as a kind of a modern bookshop. It advertised itself, and it sold modern prints. But also, it's very attentive to things like the colour scheme of the bookshop, and there are these issues about layout and bookshelves and all of that as well. But I was kind of interested, the question is partly about what else is being sold in bookshops other than just books, and I think the story is really from the start they're also selling other things, and it sometimes seems an accusation that you sometimes go in bookshops. In fact, I went into the pen bookshop the other day. Some people walked past me and said, "Oh God, wouldn't it be great to go into a bookshop that only sells books?" And I thought, yeah, I can kind of see the point, but on the other hand, they've always sold other stuff.
books have always, go back centuries, books always, I mean, they couldn't make it on the books.
Exactly.
They couldn't make it. They were selling, stationary supplies, they were selling medical material.
Yeah, so it's actually a fantasy
Yeah.
that bookstores sell only. I mean, that's kind of a piece of
Thank you, a piece of nostalgia for something that actually never was. But it's interesting to think about how in your modern cases that nostalgia gets formed or re-envisioned all the time. Wouldn't it be great too? And the always lamented thing that's just disappeared or past the horizon. Sorry.
I was walking down 8th Street near McDougal between 5th and 6th is sort of being reclaimed. There's some very fancy restaurants, and I saw McNally Jackson, the sign from that. I thought, great, a bookstore back on 8th Street, but it's all little, high-end notebooks and pens, and it's huge. And has tons of this, very overpriced stuff with a sign about how you need these things. And I said, why aren't you a bookstore? And they sort of shrugged. I said, well, we're trying to open some more bookstores.
From the art world point of view, I see the opposite happening. What's happening now is the major art galleries, the big time art galleries in New York, they all also have bookstores. And not only that, David's Werner, which is one of the very giant ones, I can't remember the name of which publisher has taken on distribution of his work. So it's had in the bookstores were selling art, but the art galleries now feel it's critical to have a book element, not only for their catalogs, but I mean books. And it's really incredible because the number of unbelievable, beautiful, and also intelligent books, and books as works of art, conceptually works of art, that I get sent to me it's incredible. And on the other hand, what's happened is there became a huge demand for this because the museums, which all used to have bookstores, now have stores that sell stuff. So, it's kind of a reverse. Yeah.
I think you also have the kind of the hybrid of fine press book and then artist books.
Oh, artist books are a huge other, yeah, huge. $100,000, artist book.
I was wondering about the Wharton Esherick's long collaboration with the Hedgerow Theater. In fact, I think he had an affair with the director of it. Yeah. He made the chairs. I mean, he supported himself not from his visual art, but from doing high-end carpentry. The one thing that the Philadelphia Museum has of his is a fireplace mantelpiece that's quite lovely. And, he himself was constantly sort of reinventing what it was he was doing in order to stay afloat. He would, if he ran out of money, he would go down to a place that literally manufactured hammers and buy handles that were rejects and make chairs out of them. And he would sell them at in considerable quantities just to sort of stay afloat. He'd started out to be a painter, and yet he was sort of integral to all these little scenes. And in a lot of ways, the whole question of, the bookstore slash, Pringle shop that most campus bookstores are today, sweatshirts and Pringles, is really an extension of that kind of improvisation. It's interesting to see. It sometimes feels a little sad, especially when you see a good bookstore like the Penn Book Center, which still does only sell books.
I don't know. I mean, Esherick actually starts out, like you said, as a painter. He then moves into wood. I mean, the first things he does in wood are frames, actually, for some of his paintings, and decides that that's really the medium that he's in love with, working with wood. And so he starts making a lot of these woodcuts, but he moves out of the woodcuts, he moves into furniture, starts to see himself as an artist in wood. So he does furniture, but he also does a lot of sculptures and other things like that. And most of his pieces, they're one of a kind. I mean, everything is different, and he doesn't manufacture the idea of multiples. I mean, they'll be, the hammer-handled chairs look alike, but there's differences between each of them. And so, you know, he's found his medium, and he moves away from doing prints. He doesn't do prints later on.
He has the, I think, only outhouse that's in the National Historic Register at the museum. It's the only modernist outhouse that probably exists.
But the whole museum is a kind of modernist venue, so to speak.
I've just got amazed. I'm going to pass through.
I see a great proliferation of book clubs held in people's homes. I know people that belong to 2 or 3 of them. They buy the book that's being read in that book club. But I don't see bookstores fostering reading groups. Or am I wrong on that?
Yeah, I think it happens in different places, and I think some of the smaller independents, like the Penn Book Center over here, they bring in a lot of authors and have discussions with authors and things like that. I mean, they're not just book signings, they're meant to really examine or think about the books and talk about them. So yeah, there's a lot going on.
I have a mic here. I was here for several other sessions, and this question came up. And I actually run a writing group at Temple, which met this morning. I said, so, here in Philadelphia, are there bookstores that have, you know, reading groups and writing groups? And I got 10 right off the top of people's heads. There's a lot of activity here. It's really great. And that doesn't even start on the coffee shops or things like First Person or Comic Con, all of which have groups. And it's really a great time for it. Here you go.
I'll do a quick plug for a probably neglected tab on the conference website that lists probably not all, but a fair number of independent Philadelphia bookstores. If you want to browse all their websites are linked there. It feels great to stretch my legs. I know all of you are stuck in your seat.
I have a question on another ground, which is I'm intrigued by the online program you're creating at Princeton. Just really intrigued. And I was wondering whether all the stuff that you're putting online, whether people are going to be able to reproduce it in books for free. That's great. That's really great, because I think it's a huge problem with authors. I mean, it's just huge. So
to speak to the rights issue, so I don't control the rights. So the
Yeah.
estate is very, very complicated. She didn't have any children, but one of her sisters had a son. He passed away a few years ago, and it's very ambiguous who has the rights to the estate. Princeton University has kind of assumed control of that estate, so they give permission to reproduce material from their own collections, but they don't charge. They may charge to make, if you have a request for 50 or 500 digitizations, but they won't charge reproducing a book.
they don't charge. And I think that's very fitting because Beach herself allowed, I mean, there now are Shakespeare and Company bookstores in Philadelphia and New York and all kinds of, that have nothing to do with her. She never took any, she just was in the great old spirit everybody used to have of share, share, and like. So,
She was never in that for the money.
yeah,
She
or,
sounds a lot like Frances. She wanted to be a catalyst to greatness.
yeah,
I think that was, she would describe herself as a midwife.
right.
Looking after Joyce was the biggest task of her career.
I was going to ask Josh if I could just the stock in the London Library, if you've got, because I know when I was looking at stuff, we had a conversation about these index cards that looked to me as if they might have been stock in the London Library. Have you kind of identified more clearly what was in the London Library?
Yeah, so each had 2 sets of records. It was kind of not the best record keeping system. So if you, she had a set of index cards by author of stock in the London Library. So you came in, I want a T.S. Eliot book. She'd look at all the T.S. Eliot books she should have. And she'd say, I have Cocktail Party. It should be on the shelf. If it wasn't on the shelf, she'd have no way of discovering who was borrowing it at that particular moment. But if she knew the person who had it, then she could find the book on the index card list. The stock of the bookshop can be recreated in a few ways. So we've recreated it just based on the titles that circulated according to the cards. And there are 9,000 books, discrete titles on those cards, and each only included the titles. So we've had, over the last summer, I had a team of 8 undergraduates matching those titles to author names and dates of publication. And now we're going to try to harmonize them with OCLC records. But then there are other resources. She, as you could tell, she's an incessant record keeper, but an inconsistent one, so that she has other inventory catalogs that she would make. So you saw the one from 1919, which is kind of a seed library. Every once in a while, she'll make a new inventory list. So from that base of the 9,000 books, we can add books that we don't have circulation records for, kind of repopulate Bookshop. But right now, those 9,000 are enough for us.
I had a question for Josh too, and that is, when you were looking at the cards, were there any authors, artists, or other figures that were in Paris at the time that weren't there that you thought should have been?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I'm trying to think examples. There definitely were people that we wished. It took us a long time to find the Joyce cards. The Joyce cards aren't at Princeton, they're at Buffalo. We have found them now. Trying to think. We don't have a Scott Fitzgerald card. So that was a disappointment, also because Fitzgerald has a connection to Princeton. His papers are at Princeton, and he was a Princeton undergraduate. The cards turn up in strange places. So there were cards scattered around. There's a few beach things, Shakespeare Company things at Texas. So there's like 7 or 8 cards there. I'm still going through all 180 boxes. Occasionally using this bookmarks, or we have a lot of cards that we cut in half. So we only have the bottom half of the cards. But people that I was expecting to see that weren't there, I'd say yes, and no one immediately comes to mind. And there are a lot of people there that I was surprised to see.
I thought, I'm very interested in Jean Rees, who was in Paris from that point, and I thought at one point I found a card for her when I was looking this up, and then I found I'd made a mistake, and it was Ernest Rees. I never remember books. But she did actually go in the bookshop. I had other evidence, and she picked up a book outside.
The one I was thinking was Beckett, who was Joyce's secretary.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's no Beckett card. So also for some people, some people she wouldn't, her close friends, eventually she stopped recording what Joyce would borrow, because it was Joyce. So the cards aren't totally perfect. So Beckett was patron, but perhaps you don't remember the Lynne Library. But he's not even in the logbooks. So very few people aren't, we would expect to see, aren't even in that vast kind of horizontal line of patrons.
I had a just a general question about the times we're in and the challenges and the sort of both the antithesis reality, and just curious about, how Brexit might be affecting worlds that you're in, or how all of us were, working in a way below the radar, I think. Maybe, there isn't a lot of scrutiny scrutiny. I mean, I find challenges just with the Europa archive, just trying to, garner support for that, and things happen, but it's also around issues of ownership and the board not wanting to let things go. I'm ready to, Al Ferris and I talked about just getting a truck and going and stealing things and bringing them to New Penn.
We'll talk.
This session is being recorded.
We're already gonna do Angel
I'll
Hair
get a
7.
license
We're
and
gonna
learn
do
to
Angel
drive.
Hair
I'll learn
7.
to drive out to Neurotic.
But just curious, I know this has been such a, heartbreaking here. I knew Robert Wilson and went early to that story. Diana lived there for a while on the street, and just so many, it just brings up so much. But, thinking about the, realities we're facing as a world. I mean, in Europa, we had to, when the floods came, and we had black mold in our poetics office, so we had to abandon that building. And we're on a floodplain. The things right now are being stored on a floodplain. There's promise when we get enough money, we'll move it to a better spot. It's just been a roller coaster, and I'm probably the person who's been there the longest, but I'm not there full time. And the people who work there have never been to New York City, things like that, and don't know how to spell Allen Ginsberg's name. Anyway, I'm asking just for it's been so exciting and optimistic, and just this guy. Well, you probably do this all the time. You should learn more of these topics.
No, it's complicated. I mean, it's a complicated process of, archiving materials, and it's not, we bring in things here, but it's complicated for us, as David will attest. I mean, just working through the Gotham Book Mart, and we're not completely through with that. These are huge collections, and they require a lot of time, energy, and unfortunately money, and just being able to do it is a complicated process. And you multiply that by all these other other institutions that take on collections and hope that they can then process the material and make it available for people to use. It's not easy. I mean, it's easy to say, okay, we'll take it, but it's really, the hard part is then actually processing it, as Brad will attest. I mean, going through box after box of this kind of material and working through it and trying to figure out what you've got, how you're going to organize it, how you're going to make it accessible, where people are going to use it, all of these issues. So I think, I must say, we're 10 years into Gotham right now, and as David said, I spent 5 years working on Gotham before sort of handing it off and said, I have other things I have to do right now. So, I totally understand. It's a big process. I understand what you're going through, and all the issues around buildings and climate and all of that is really, really difficult as well.
Two things to add to that. One, just acknowledge the strange asymmetry of the world we live in. That we're in a place like Penn, it's incredibly wealthy. I'm at Princeton, which is an incredibly wealthy institution.
Wealthier than we are.
Yeah, no, fair enough. It's not my money. But just what the reality is that we know and the realities that we live and how they intersect is something that it's hard to reckon with. I think
And
that's
you're
one
safe in the climate we're in?
Yeah.
The climate, the literal climate.
Well, that's the question. I don't think anyone can say that they're safe in it. But I think it's also equally false that we all claim equal precariousness in that world, especially when we're in a place like Princeton. And I can even use the word we, right? There are different levels of precariousness that everyone has in this room based on many different factors. So it's hard to understand, I think, or hard to reckon with. I think that's really our task as people and scholars, to reckon with that, the thing I'm calling that asymmetry. So that's the big claim I wanted to make. The small claim was just, at Princeton, they'll buy almost anything asked them to buy book-wise. But archives are really, really difficult, not because of the prices, but because of the labor involved in processing. So there's been a couple of amazing archives I really wanted to acquire for the university, and they just can't devote 5 years of incredibly talented staff time to processing them. And that's the big, we talked earlier with Lee's about what gets thrown away. And that's one of the things that processing forces institutions to reckon with. What gets accepted and what gets thrown away.
But I think this is also an area where, those of us who work in libraries and work with collections and those, people who want to be, use those collections really need to start working together more and more and more. I know we do a lot of it here at Penn, but I think part of that is finding ways to then process, teaching graduate students about these kinds of things. So all of these pieces of it are going to be really important to be able to actually acquire this material and make sure it doesn't disappear. So I think it's, it's a call to everybody here that we have to work at the, work on this together to be able to preserve this heritage.
Josh, just going back to the cards for a minute. Something smaller, but not as worldly. Looking at Hemingway's card, there were things that he bought that were noted. Then there was BB. Was that brought back the same day? Is that bought book? I mean,
Book bought, yeah.
Okay, book bought.
Yeah.
You've decided after going through enough cards, right?
Yeah, there's lots of different, so she would use the cards for lots of different, 98% are borrowed in the state, returned in the state, and then 2 to 5% are book bought, book gifted.
Right, yeah, I was going back and forth trying to decide what it meant, and it wasn't clear.
Actually, could you pass right behind you?
I can do that.
Yeah, no, I have a quick question about the reading experience, because it seems to me we don't have a lot of evidence of, what customers wanted to read. And Josh, of course, you have some evidence with the cards. So how can we do more research on readers, on customers, people who actually came to those bookshops?
That's what I'm hoping this project will allow scholars to do, exactly that. Not just who came and what did they read, but also a glimpse of how they read it and what they read it in common with, why they read it. So you can say, well, this person was my neighbor, that person was that person's neighbor, they read it before, so you can kind of presume the recommendation. That's really what I'm most interested in. And to supplement the famous story of Ulysses, with respect to reading is, well, not the most famous story, but one is Ernest Hemingway's copy, right, which is only open but half the way through. So you kind of see where he stopped reading and when he stopped opening it. But this is another way of thinking about that as well. If someone borrowed Ulysses for 3 days, you can presume they probably didn't read it. But if they borrowed it for 2 months, you can't know anything. You can't. That's not going to do that.
So David gave me the microphone, said this is the last question, but actually it's a thank you to everybody. And picking up Anne and Lynne, what you were saying is how wonderful it is to have this celebration of the opening and pulling all this together. Your faculty, your emerging scholars, but the archivists and the librarians talking and seeing how collections are used and mining and bringing all these themes together and understanding all the questions you can get. You're not just reading a book, you're finding who the readers were and how things were marketed and how things were consumed and just the environment that's so rich in all of these. And I especially think, as I said to Lise earlier, that going further and bringing the creators more in, the appreciation raises that awareness of the value for saving it and finding other uses for it. But anyway, thank you so much for bringing everyone together. It's been great to hear everything.
Bartender is eager to crack. We have a lovely little spread for you to reward you for your questions and for your questions.